Echolalia is when a child repeats what you say or what others are saying, or you repeat something that is heard in a movie or online. It could be a word, a phrase, a sentence. It could even be an entire chunk of information. The word echo is Greek and it means to repeat, and lalia means speech, so the repetition of speech. An example of echolalia, for instance, is let's say a child is completing a puzzle, and when he's done, he shouts, "Well done!" But he doesn't seem to be speaking to anyone. He is repeating a phrase that his father might have used to praise him when he successfully completed a puzzle or, some other kind of activity. And his words could also be a spontaneous request for an affirmation. Your child might repeat the words that you say immediately, or he might do it much later, perhaps even weeks or months later. And so many parents of children with autism are confused by the habit of echolalia. Their child is speaking, but in a way that seems irregular or strange. And he is talking, but he doesn't really seem to be communicating. So, the reality that I want to address in this video is that echolalia does have meaning and it usually serves a purpose. And in many instances, one of the purposes of echolalia is that it constitutes communication. And from the point of view of children with autism, this is, of course, very important. But before I get into this, let's just look at some useful information about echolalia that will help us, to put it into perspective. So the first thing to know is that echolalia is common to both neurotypical and autistic children. Neurotypical children will tend to repeat words that they have heard spoken by others when they are toddlers and while they are learning to communicate. However, at some stage, maybe age 2 or 3, they will usually know how to string words together in flexible ways to be able to make a phrase or a sentence. And these phrases or sentences are, of course, used to communicate with others. But autistic children, on the other hand, will learn language in a different way. They may not understand the meaning of many individual words, or if they do understand the meaning of individual words, they may not yet know how to string words together so as to construct a sentence or a phrase. And also, there are many autistic children who know a lot but will not use what they know in order to communicate with others in conventional ways. So, as a result of this disability, this inability to construct sentences, autistic children will tend to internalize whole phrases, whole sentences, which they then connect to specific situations. And so, when the situation arises again, they will repeat the sentence or phrase that they have picked up and are able to say. So, they may not understand some of the individual words in the sentence, but they have made this connection between a situation and a phrase that they know. And so, this act of speaking in context is a kind of communication, even if we choose to label it as echolalia. Let's look at a concrete example of this, where a child makes a connection between a situation and an echolalic expression. Say you think your child is hungry and you say, "Do you want some bread?" And your child doesn't reply, but you go on to give him a slice of toast. And then a week later, your child comes back to you and says, "Do you want some bread?" Now, your child is not really asking you whether you want bread, and he's not going to get bread for you. What he is expressing is his own want. He is, in fact, asking you to get him some bread. So he does not as yet have the ability to say, "I want toast." He cannot as yet construct this sentence. So instead, he uses the echolalic phrase, "Do you want some bread?" to communicate with you and to tell you what he wants. And so within this context, he's speaking, although echolalic is clearly a form of communication. And so for this reason, I feel that echolalia cannot be ignored, it cannot be dismissed, and we should also bear in mind that in many instances, children with autism will use echolalia for much longer periods of time than their neurotypical peers. And so it's important for carers to be able to understand it, identify it, because it can, in many instances, constitute an act of communication. Let's take another example of echolalia. Say your child says, "Peekaboo, I see you." This is echolalia, but it might be your child's way of asking you to play this game with him, or perhaps to play any game that you usually play together. For him, this phrase has come to represent the time that you spend with him when you play a particular game or you play games together. However, we do need to also remember that all echolalia is not communication. Some of it serves a range of other purposes. So let's take some examples. Let's say a child uses a phrase repeatedly and he does it to calm himself down or to make himself secure. This is obviously echolalia that is being used for emotional regulation, and it can be regarded as a stim. Or let's say he repeats a particular phrase when he's feeling stressed or anxious. Let's say he's in a social situation, he's surrounded by a lot of strange people, and then he starts to repeat this phrase in order to manage his own uncertainty, his own anxiety. Um, or another example, let's say that he is in an interaction, but he doesn't fully understand the conversation, or he doesn't understand a question that is being directed at him. So he uses the echolalia here as a way of trying to stay in the interaction, as a way of trying to participate and communicate, even though he doesn't fully understand what is being talked about. He is attempting to stay within the conversation, and this is a very positive act for a child who has autism. And then also, children with autism do a lot of self-talking, where they repeat certain phrases, to themselves as they are processing their own thoughts or as they are working through something that they are doing. For example, let's say a child is making a salad, and as he is making the salad, he verbalizes each step of the process, perhaps because he has been taught to do it in this way. Um, the echolalia here is a way of helping him through his task, allowing him to complete it, as would be um, echolalia to process thoughts. So parents, carers, and teachers need to know how to recognize echolalia when it constitutes communication, importantly, because they will then be able to respond to it. They will need to take the opportunity to communicate with their child when the opportunity presents itself. So the first thing I would say is do not dismiss echolalia, do not ignore it. Take note of your child's words when they are being used, the context or the circumstances in which they are being used. So, as a child, for example, let's say he's looking at a cake and he says, "Yummy." So, he's repeating what he has heard in the past when other cakes were around, but he is probably also asking for a slice of cake. And so, yes, for now, if you look at it, this is going to be a kind of guessing game on your part, as it is not conventional communication. When you are talking to a child who has limited speech or is heavily echolalic, avoid the use of pronouns. Instead of saying you or I, say mummy, say Sally. Avoid asking too many questions, as your child might end up repeating your questions as a way of communicating with you. So instead of the questions and the pronouns, use very short, simple phrases and sentences or even single words so that you can give words to your child's actions and experiences. Give him phrases that he is capable of using. Here are some examples of what you might say. He's going down the slide, so you say down slide, or wee. He's washing hands, you say wash hands. He's playing with a car, you say play car. He's taking off his shoes, you say take off shoes. Use the simplest phrase you can think of and sometimes maybe just a single word. Your child is going to be more likely to use these simple phrases, sentences, single words the next time he is in that situation. You are giving him ideas about what to say, but those ideas should, of course, be very simple. You can think of this as laying words upon his actions. So if he's watching Star Trek, say, Jamie is watching Star Trek, rather than saying, oh, that looks interesting. What's the name of that movie that you are watching? Use a kind of telegraphic speak, and when your child speaks, respond in a way that matches his ability. So if he says vroom, you say vroom vroom. Or if he says car, you say go car. Or you say vroom, and then one of you pushes the car forward. You can also try to teach your child a fill in sentence, and with a fill in sentence, what you are giving your child is the opportunity to be able to make a sentence up by himself spontaneously. So let's say, for instance, your child, you know that in the morning your child wants cereal. So what you will do is go to the cereal packet and say want cereal, and then get your child to repeat the words want cereal. And once he's said it, you then give him the desired item. And so use this pattern, this practice with many things, that your child might want in many different situations. And you might find that he's actually going to get to the point where he's going to couple the word want to a particular thing that he wants. So he might then say, want cookie spontaneously. You've never said want cookie to him, and he says it because he wants a cookie. Or he might say, want ginger, which means I want to play with my cat. And this is all the beginning of spontaneous communication because what he has done is constructed his own sentence, which he is then using to communicate. And then this is no longer echolalia, it is spontaneous communication. The other suggestion is, of course, to improve your child's vocabulary. Teach him as many new words as possible using real objects or toys or flashcards. Encourage him to label things. But I would say that you should work on items and objects that are in his house, in his garden, in places that he visits regularly. For example, his swimming class. All of this increases the chances that he will use the words to communicate because it relates to his actual experiences, to what he is seeing, and to what he is doing. And at the same time, know that it is more valuable for your child to know a few words and then use these words to communicate rather than for him to know hundreds of words that he is not using for communication purposes. And it does not matter that his communication is simple. It can be very simple, like want go park or want breakfast or I see bird. The point of him knowing words, of understanding words, is that they are primarily used for communication purposes, but of course they are also important for your child to know uh, um, as a learning tool. It is how he relates to the world, how he knows what specific things are, and how he understands his own actions. So, as a toddler and as a young child, my daughter used a lot of echolalia. But over time, the more words she learned and then started to, use these words to ask for things, to label things, and to stay in very short exchanges, the less reliant she became on echolalia, and the more it began to fade away. So she began to make her own sentences using the words she knew, and these sentences were often very short, they were very rigid. She used a sort of formula to create her sentences. But the point was that she was making her own sentences and she was communicating spontaneously. To give you an example of an early conversation we might have had, would be, let's say, she says, want chicken. I give her the chicken and I say, it's hot. And she might repeat the word hot. And then I say, love chicken. And she says, yummy. So now, as a young adult, she's no longer echolalic, but she does a lot of what you would call scripting, which means that she learns a fixed phrase online. For example, the phrase, I mean it when I say. And then she will take this phrase and she will insert it into conversations in places where she considers the insertion to be appropriate. So, as I said, this is a kind of scripting. And she also does repeat certain phrases for self calming purposes, so not for communication. So, the important thing I would say is to understand the dynamics of echolalia, to work with it rather than against it. It is definitely a positive on the road of helping a child with autism to communicate spontaneously.